My name is Christine Cali-Sanchez, and I am the Associate Director of the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at FIU and European and Eurasian Studies program. It is my pleasure today to welcome you to this wonderful panel that we have, the Roundtable on Migration and Race in Sociology, Theory and Practice in a Transatlantic Perspective, which is part of a 3-year grant on the theme of societal inclusion and societal diversity, which we at Florida International University received from the European Union. Today's panel aims to explore the intersection of human mobility, race, and ethnicity in South Florida from diverse perspectives, including transatlantic comparison with Europe. Before we start, I would like to thank the European Commission, the delegation of the European Union to the United States, for graciously founding this roundtable. Our partners at Florida International University, the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs, the Department of Politics and International Relations, the Politics of International Relations Student Graduate Organization, the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies, the CIPA Václav Program for Human Rights and Diplomacy, the Center for Women and Gender Studies, and Florida for Ukraine. I want to sincerely thank you all our panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time today to be with us. And last but not least, our moderator. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to him, Ernesto Fiochetto, who is our Ph.D. candidate in the Department of Politics and International Relations and our graduate assistant at the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Ernesto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christine. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence Roundtable titled Migration and Race in South Florida, Theory and Practice in a Transatlantic Perspective. I'm honored to welcome you here to this roundtable with these 3 really great speakers that are with us today. So please help me welcome Dr. Vrushali Pathil, Mr. Jack Maguire, and Ms. Daria Salivatna. Yes. Thank you very much to all 3 of you for your presence at the roundtable. It means a lot to us, so thank you. Thank you for your time and your presence. So migration, when we speak about migration in southern Florida, there are many things that probably come to our mind. But in the last decades, rapid growth has transformed southern Florida's landscape from rural to urban to global in a few years. Immigration has become a significant contributor to such a development. The COVID-19 pandemic added complexity to such a diversity, to the diversity in this area, and I will just take 2 examples. I mean, on the one, extreme examples. On the one hand, during the pandemic, entrepreneurs and investors relocated from traditional tech hubs to emerging startup ecosystems such as Miami, and Miami saw a net migration of 145% in the last 2 years. In contrast, in the last half of July 2022 alone, more than 200 migrants from Haiti and Cuba had been apprehended by US border officials in the area. Moreover, South Florida has become home to many Ukrainian refugees fleeing from the Russian invasion of our country. The origin, cause of migrating, possibilities and experiences of each person who enters South Florida as an immigrant are therefore immeasurably diverse. Human mobility intersects with race, ethnicity, and other categories in such a complex environment. This roundtable will explore those intersections, particularly focusing on how human mobility and race and ethnicity plays against each other in the different experiences migrants in South Florida live. So the panelists will discuss the topic from a theoretical, policy, and practical perspectives, addressing some questions for around 15 minutes each. And then we will have about 20 minutes for questions and answers from the audience and 10 minutes for the closing remarks. So I encourage you to take down notes and think of questions, because this is a roundtable. The idea is to participate and to make questions to enhance our discussion. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker today, who will address the theoretical perspective of our topic. Dr. Vrushali Pathil is an associate professor of sociology and chair of the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies at Florida International University. She writes and teaches at the intersection of gender and sexuality studies, post-colonial, decolonial studies, and historical sociology. She has published in several prestigious academic journals, and her latest book is titled Webbed Connectivities, the Imperial Sociology of Sex, Gender, and Sexuality. Read the book. This is on me. Read the book. It's fascinating. So welcome, Dr. Pathil. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Pathil, faculty, students, but also activists, social workers, non-profit organizations, politicians, and average citizens think about the situation of migration in South Florida. We have different opinions, and many of us try to respond and act in this situation. That said, I have two questions for you that hopefully would shed some lights on our thoughts and our actions. The first one is, when we analyze human mobility in the academia, or in social work or activism, etc., what main theoretical categories must we consider and why? What is the role of race and ethnicity or other categories like sex or gender? And my second question is, considering the transatlantic perspective, what are the influences of empire and coloniality for the analysis of migration?
Thank you very much. Thank you for those great questions, the very nice introduction. Hi, everyone. Do I need the microphone? Okay. All right. All right. I want to thank you for the invitation to this to participate on this panel, and thank you, Christine, for all of the work you've put into this. So I do want to clarify before we get started, I'm not a scholar of immigration. I'm a global historical sociologist, and I focus on the intersections of race and gender and sexuality in global historical perspective. So I was asked to contribute to our conversation today with sort of theoretical concepts that we can use to help us think through some of these questions and issues. And so there are two main concepts that I'd like to offer for our conversation today. The first one is webbed connectivities, which I assume folks have not heard of because I just made it up not too long ago. But I think that web connectivities, which I will talk about in a few minutes, can be helpful for thinking about how human mobility unfolds in a global historical perspective and context. The second concept I want to introduce for our conversation today is the concept of intersectionality. Now, this one has been around for quite a while. Many of you may have already heard of it. This one is fundamental, I think, for helping us think about how human mobility is shaped by race, ethnicity, as well as gender, sexuality, and other important categories of experience and inequality. So I'll talk about both of these concepts, and in my comments, I'll say a little bit about South Florida, but I also want to frame what I'm talking about in a larger sort of global historical perspective. Okay. So the concept of web connectivities, like I said, is something that I've developed in my work. And basically, web connectivities highlight the broad global histories of entanglement constituted by imperial, colonial, racial, and other networks, which have connected different spaces since at least the proto-colonial period of the 16th century. Thinking about these global histories and entanglements is important for understanding the larger context within which human movements of multiple kinds occur, whether we're talking about migration, right? Or, even if we're talking about movements that have to do with colonial conquest and settlement, or movements that have to do with the transatlantic slave trade. All of those different kinds of mobilities can be situated in this broader context. Regarding Florida and South Florida in particular, I think we know Florida itself emerges as a site on the colonial map, is itself named as a territory in the context of the early European colonial explorations on behalf of sort of God, gold, and glory, as they say, since the 16th century, right? So the territory in particular, I think we know, gets its name from the Spanish explorer Ponce de Leon in the early 16th century. He thought he found an island. He named it La Florida for the Pascua Florida, or Feast of Flowers, which is celebrated at Easter. Indeed, Florida emerges as a place of interest and significance amidst the long history of competition and conflict among the empires of Spain, France, England, and eventually the US. And of course, the territory does not become a part of the US until the early 1800s. This larger context of colonialism and empire is significant furthermore because of the hierarchical ideas of race and ethnicity that it engendered, and that continue to be a really important part of the so-called modern world, right? Indeed, the assumption on the part of European colonial powers about their right or their legitimacy to engage in colonial conquest was premised on such notions of hierarchy. There are lots of places to look for this, to think about it and understand it. One place to look at is what's been called the doctrine of discovery. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued a papal bull, right, that stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, right, claimed and exploited by Christian rulers, and declared that, quote, the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself, unquote. So from the beginning, there was a religious, civilizational, and racial hierarchy embedded in the project of colonization, which would be elaborated over the centuries in various ways. Now, while gender and sexuality aren't explicitly mentioned there, it's important to note that ideas about civilized versus savage gender and sexuality often buoyed notions of religious, civilizational, and racial hierarchy as well. This doctrine of discovery would also become the basis of all European claims in the Americas. While the papal bull gave explicit right to Spain to colonize, France and England eventually claimed this right as well. Over time, the specific rationales for and the articulation of civilizational and racial hierarchies it was premised on would shift. Nevertheless, the logic of the hierarchy itself is deeply embedded in the process. And there's lots of scholarship on how these histories help to produce and globalize a racial hierarchy which, though not operating in the same way everywhere, still generally positions whiteness at the top and in varying ways blackness and indigeneity at the bottom. So human mobility occurs within these historic racialized web connectivities and is shaped by them, also shaping them in turn. These processes shape the movements of settlement of white European colonial communities in the Americas. They also feed the U.S.'s settler colonialism and westward expansion across the continent. They help to justify the transatlantic slave trade and its contribution to the creation of the African diaspora. And these processes have ongoing consequences in terms of shaping discourses about migration and citizenship in the US. Who deserves to be allowed into the country, right? Who does not? Who deserves to be a citizen and who does not? What will be the implications for allowing a particular group into the country, for the culture of the nation, and for its demographic and racial makeup, right? These are conversations that we have today. So the concept of webbed connectivities highlights the racial, colonial, and imperial networks that have connected different spaces since at least the 16th century, and gives us a larger context for situating human mobilities of various kinds. Oh, all right. Okay, I do need it. Okay. Should I continue? Okay. Hi. Okay, perfect, thank you. In addition to web connectivities, the second major concept that I'd like to introduce for our discussion today is intersectionality. If web connectivities helps us think about the larger context, intersectionality is a framework and a method for trying to understand the complex operation of inequality and power dynamics in the contemporary world. Intersectionality is a term that comes from Black feminist and women of color activism and scholarship to center the ways in which multiple forms of identities and inequalities work together to impact the lives of individuals in complex ways. When the framing was first offered, it was about naming the particular ways in which Black women and women of color experience oppression as a combination of racial oppression and gender oppression. So for example, if you try to understand the experiences of Black women only through a racial lens, you might miss the ways in which gender impacts them, right? Likewise, if you try to understand the experiences of Black women only through a gender lens, you might miss the ways in which race impacts them. So you really need an approach that highlights the intersection of racial and gender oppression, or intersectionality. The concept has developed and become really important for thinking about how social experiences and oppressions more generally are never shaped by just one factor, but are in fact complex, shaped by multiple processes having to do with race, ethnicity, gender, class, and so on, right? And so an individual's social location, which is a term for how they're positioned in the social world based on all of these various classifications and categories, all of those things work together to shape their experiences in the world. Coming back to human mobility then, we can think about the experiences of human mobility in terms of the multiple social categories that are operating simultaneously. So we can think about how race, class, legal status, language, gender, sexuality, religion, and so on are all working together to shape the experience of mobility for different people in different ways. In the context of South Florida, for example, we can think about a whole host of social categories that matter, right? So for example, migrant experiences are fundamentally shaped by the question of how they are racialized, right? Within a particular space. Are they racialized as white? Are they racialized as Black? Maybe it varies based on context, but all of that is significant for how they experience the social world. Their experiences also vary profoundly based on class status, right? Class status determines basic things like where you live, whether you have health insurance. If you're a child, it can determine where you go to school, right? Whether you have to work while you're in school. Do you have to leave school at different times of the year to help your family make ends meet? So imagine a young immigrant working class girl who has to leave school during certain months of the year to help her family on the farm. Compare her to a young immigrant girl who maybe lives in a middle-class family and a middle-class neighborhood and who gets to go to school every day and has more resources, right? Those differences are deeply consequential for the kind of immigrant experience that each of them will have. Another category to think about, religion. In a predominantly Christian society, what does it mean to practice voodoo? In a predominantly Christian post-9/11 society, what does it mean to be a Muslim? Migrant experiences are also, of course, gendered. There's a lot of scholarship that talks about how women migrants are made to bear the brunt of maintaining cultural traditions in the context of immigration and are policed by immigrant communities in particular ways. Scholarship here also shows how they're incorporated into the host economy in very gender and race-specific ways. Additionally, in the context of the heteronormative culture of the US, we classify individuals as male or female, right? Based on their assigned or ascribed sex, and we expect them to be heterosexual. Those kinds of assumptions have implications for non-binary and queer-identified migrants, right? So an intersectional perspective helps us think about how migrants experience all of these things, how their experiences in terms of access, inclusion, rights, belonging, and how all of those things vary tremendously at the different intersections of these varying statuses. These intersections are consequential in terms of how these migrants will be treated by political and economic and police and other institutions. They matter in terms of the social interactions these immigrants will have with others. And they matter in terms of immigrant identity. Together then, the theoretical concepts of web connectivities and intersectionality help us think about human mobility, race and ethnicity in global, historical, and complex ways. I'll just end there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pathil. I have a lot of questions, but we will continue with this with our next speaker. So let me introduce Mr. Jack Maguire. He's a Ph.D. candidate at the Department of Global and Sociocultural Studies and heads the Václav Havel program's Global Immigration and Migration Initiative, which seeks to explore issues related to migration throughout the world through an interdisciplinary lens and with a focus on human rights. His research focuses on how changing immigration policies and laws impact immigrant communities in Miami. Welcome, Jack, and thank you. I believe it's arduous to analyze and understand the migration policy and its consequences, especially here in South Florida. Many discourses and different opinions exist out there. Politicians gave diverse responses according to their understanding of the situation. And in the last few years, we have listened to contrasting news about migration in our area, such as the fact that migrants from Haiti and Cuba have been apprehended by the US border officials, and the increase of entrepreneurs and investors and high qualified migrants that arrived in Miami, but also the plane loads of asylum seekers flown to Martha's Vineyard and some other places, the modifications of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, also known as DACA, etc., etc., etc. So given this complexity, I want to ask you two questions. The first one is, probably it's not easy, what is the situation of the immigration system now, and how did we end up here? And the second question is, how do we get out of here? What solutions can we have? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Just this thing on? Okay, cool. No, just like to say, thank you for having me here. I thank you very much for the Jeanette Morin Center for having this event and for allowing me to be a participant. The state of our immigration system currently is it is not capable of doing what it needs to be doing. And a big reason for that is that we've just had this huge emphasis on immigration enforcement for the last 40 plus years, and specifically focused along the U.S.-Mexico southern border. And so because of that, our system, we've just invested more and more and more resources basically into border enforcement, and then more recently, since about the 2000s, on interior enforcement, particularly after 9/11. Giving a lot of money to the Customs and Border Patrol, giving a lot of money to immigration and ICE, anyway, immigration enforcement here inside the United States. But there hasn't been really any money to go towards processing. And so when we look here, a big problem that we have is the bureaucratic body that's in charge of processing immigrant visas, immigrant applications of all sorts, the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, doesn't have the funding, doesn't have the resources it needs to be able to handle what we're going through now, which is that there have been these huge displacements of people in all over the world who, thanks to technological advances, can get to the United States much easier than they used to in the past. And we've created avenues for people who are wealthy to be able to come and access our system very easily. So if you look at there's an employment-based visa system here in the United States, you'll see, for instance, something that's changed recently over the years has been that immigrants from Asia, particularly India and I believe China, are actually people who have the highest earnings here in the United States. That did not used to be the case about 20 or 30 years ago. That's a recent change, and the reason for that is because that we have imported a lot of skilled labor from India and China in the realm of tech, particularly for tech industries and also for medical purposes. And we have not done the same thing for low skilled labor, for people who labor in. Basically, they do the jobs that we don't want to do. They're the people who flip your burgers. They're the people who who cut up the meat that you package, that gets packaged in the stores. Or the people that pick our fruit. So for instance, a really good example of this is during the pandemic, while everyone was locked down, we wouldn't have been able to get food had it not been for these workers. They were not able to. They were not able to go in and just isolate and not work. They had to go work during the middle of this pandemic, being in these just horrible situations that we have a really difficult time even comprehending, most people. It was something that actually Dr. Pathil mentioned, the comparison between the immigrant girl from the lower class, the immigrant girl from the middle class, their different experiences. In my research, one of the last interviews I did was actually with the Venezuelan family who they had immigrated here in the early 2000s, and they just had a series of really unfortunate events. The mother was in an abusive relationship that she had to leave. She had 3 kids, and it's like, what do you do? She had to end up overstaying her visa, and they got kicked out of their apartment at one point in time because I believe their mother lost their job, and all of her kids are in public school. And so the daughter, who was the older one, had to stop going to school to take care of the family and try and help her mom out around the home, and they ended up being homeschooled to complete their education. And it's just like, what do you do? And so she's actually, thankfully she got married. She's going to be able to adjust her status to residency, but she couldn't even do that before TPS happened because she didn't have any documentation. And in the state of Florida, you need to have certain documentation from the state of Florida in order to be able to apply for a marriage license. And so it's like we have all these different ways in which we think that the system is supposed to function where it doesn't function. And the problem is that we've created this world. And so it's like, it's something that's frustrating as someone who comes to try and support immigrants' rights, and is that we don't recognize, and if I try and come up here and say that particularly the United States, and also we go into Europe through these colonial histories, has created these giant global disparities in the world, not just in terms of economics, but in terms of security, in terms of ability to just live where you were born. And a lot of that has to do with the history of capitalism, the search for labor. Capitalism you know, and once again, like when I say these things in public, like it's like, well, you're an American hater, well, you're this crazy socialist like person. It's like, no, it's just objective reality that capitalism. So, for instance, we look at what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris just announced, like I can't remember if it was a year or two ago, that they're going to do this big investment in Central America to try and stop people from coming to the United States by creating opportunities. The problem with that is it's following the recent formula that we've had since about World War II, which is where we're just breaking open these countries to foreign investment to try and create basically export industries that feed consumerism in the United States. And so what that does is that extracts wealth from these countries and brings it to the United States. And while it might benefit a small portion of people there, what it ultimately does is it feeds into this wealth extraction from these areas and brings it more to the U.S. Like we haven't created these systems in order to be beneficial to other parts of the world, really. You know, we've created these systems in order to be beneficial to us. And so we have really centralized these areas of relative stability until now in Europe and North America and Australia. And we've done it for our own benefit. And we're dealing with the negative effects of that now in that people can't live where they've been living. In El Salvador, there's some crazy amount, like groundwater, like there's 80% of groundwater or something like that is heavily is polluted. Like it's not safe to drink. And so when we're in the U.S., we can look specifically at the case of, and please let me know when I need to stop because I'll keep going. Okay, because I will keep going. We look at it before 1965 was we had these immigration reforms in 1965 that came about as part of the civil rights movement. You know, civil rights movement drove a lot of changes, and particularly we had a very explicitly race-based immigration system in the United States where it basically barred all immigration from everywhere but Europe, and specifically Northern Europe. And Mexican labor was more or less able to come to the United States and do what it had done for a long time, which was seasonally work in the agriculture industry and then go back. And there wasn't really these legal classifications that we have now. What happened in 1965 is that changed. All of a sudden, Mexicans didn't have the access to these visas that they had, and there was a much greater emphasis on they became quote unquote illegal. We basically created this category of illegal that Mexicans then fit into. And there's all these systems that were in place that had grown up, that had developed historically over a period of time, and people's livelihoods are based on this, where, okay, I go and I work, I make money, you know, in the agriculture industry for the season, and I go back to Mexico. And so once that illegal category was created, media started catching on to this, politicians started catching on to this, bureaucrats started catching on to this, where it's, if we sensationalize this immigration, if we try and make it sound dangerous, if we highlight these specific episodes of these really unfortunate events where people do come, where there's like these individuals that don't, they're like 0.11111% of the people that come in, that it generates views on media, that it generates, it allows politicians to get elected. So when we look at the stuff for Martha's Vineyard, for instance, like that's not gonna do anything. Like that's the, I mean, it's the, you know, it was something like 50 people or maybe 50, 100 people being sent to Martha's Vineyard. It's not going to actually solve anything. It's not going to do anything, but it raises the politician's profile in that I'm the one trying to combat this immigration. And it basically, it gets people funding. If you're a bureaucrat, so if you're if you're someone trying to get funding for Customs and Border Patrol or ICE, you know, like highlighting these episodes gets you more money from Congress. If you're a politician, demonizing immigrants gets you more votes than if you try and support immigrants. So you do that. And if you're the media, when you highlight these videos, particularly along the U.S.-Mexico border, it creates this fear, this moral panic, and that gets you more views turned in. And so we've had this really, as Douglas Massey has looked at this, as vicious feedback loop that is really based on a lot of things that Dr. Pathil talked about, particularly regarding race, of, you know, oh my God, there's these people coming in, they don't look like us, they're the people that we have historically marginalized and are othered. And it's just created this snowballing effect, basically, since starting in the 1970s, 1980s, really is where it started to take off, where it's just, we've just funneled money and resources into immigration enforcement and trying to stop. Exactly. Yeah. Disconnecting and reconnecting it. Hello, hello? Hello? Perfect. To where we're in the situation we're at now, and Republicans and Democrats have fed into this. Republicans have been admittedly, like it's a false equivalency to say they've been the same, but until recently, it's really been a fairly shared effort in terms of making the system try to punish people. And so there's two different strategies that have been really implemented. One is called prevention through deterrence, and the other one is called, oh my God, why did I make it? Attrition through enforcement. And so prevention through deterrence is basically making conditions along the U.S.-Mexico border so dangerous. And so it started off just trying to basically just build walls and put immigration enforcement in places like San Diego, where there used to be a lot of crossings, so that it would push people into the desert and would force them to go into the desert. And the thinking being that the terrain and the climate, which is incredibly harsh, would stop people from immigrating. For one, it would prevent them from immigrating. But what it did is it just drove these people into more and more dangerous regions of the border, and it started making them pay more and more for smugglers who are sometimes part of the cartels and who are really exploitative. So it started funding those networks, and it just really began just this increasing level of violence along the U.S.-Mexico border. And one thing that did is it actually, so people, instead of going back and forth, they started making one-way trips. And so they would become, instead of going back and forth, they would go, okay, I'm going to be here and I'm going to be in the United States until I complete my economic goals for my family, and then I'll leave. So you started having this growth in the undocumented population. And then what happens after that is they're in here, so now we're thinking, okay, we've got to make them leave. So we're going to try mass deportation. Well, mass deportation doesn't really work, particularly when you're in, these immigrants are critical to your economy. Once again, our food, our medical care, taking care of the elderly, other things like that. So what do? You make the system so horrible inside the United States that they eventually choose to leave. And so we get these people for when they're young and when they're contributing to the economy, and then when they're old and when we would need to take care of them, they end up going back to where they were, unless they have some sort of family relations here in the United States that can sustain them and support them, which many of them do. And it's just created a system that's not built for what we need. And so it's one of these things where you sort of beat your head against the wall if you're trying to support immigrants' rights, and it's something that politicians say all the time. The reforms really need to come from Congress. But we're so gridlocked at Congress that we can't really do anything. And so, it's like, how do we get out of here is very tough. It's going to, part of it is we have to rethink what we're doing globally. That's actually the root cause. We have to let countries become more than something than just a part of the global supply chain. And so that's really the big problem with Central America and Mexico and these other parts of the world which are displacing large amounts of immigrants, is we've just decided that since 1945, that we're just making them basically a part of the global supply chain to feed consumerism in different parts of the world, mainly in North America. That's like the best economic model. And then part of that comes with that, though, is you get rid of people's like Social Security, you get rid of their, the social safety nets in their country, you privatize everything, and so they just become much less secure. So we have to rethink that. We have to let countries become something more than just a link in the global supply chain. And then what we have to do here in the U.S. is, I wish I had the silver bullet. I really wish I do. My goal more recently, I guess, through talking to people is just try and create empathy for people who don't get empathy, even though they're in these really horrible situations that are they're part of these much larger systems. And so you'll go, well, it's, it's your fault. You made this decision to come here. You brought your kids here. You're the one who did this thing. You're here. It's like, well, I don't even try to address that. I just say, well, this is their story. This is what happened. This woman had to she knowingly took, I forget what the name of the shot is, but like the shot, basically a shot before she immigrated to the United States that would protect her from getting pregnant, because something like 80% of women who come to the United States through this southern route across the U.S.-Mexico border, they get raped. Like, and people know these things before they come. They don't. It's different. Definitely, their experience afterwards, is different. They have a different understanding of it, but they know they're risking their lives. And so I think it's just a generating a much broader movement of empathy beyond DACA recipients, beyond the children that have come here in the U.S., while it's been very important, is much needed to extend that to the parents and to the people here who are undocumented, to hopefully create change to where we can come up with realistic solutions that need to happen. So anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Jack. Thank you. Well, last but not least, I'm delighted to introduce Ms. Daria Salivatna. Daria is responsible for the operations and communications of the Florida for Ukraine nonprofit organization. She was born in Ukraine. She has been in the hospitality and restaurant business for over 15 years, but still, more importantly for this roundtable, she has been part of a few nonprofit organizations in various countries where she has lived. Well, Daria, we are very happy to have you here today. Thank you very much. We have used the term transatlantic perspective several times in this roundtable, and I believe that you significantly embody this concept for diverse reasons. Well, first, because you were born in Ukraine and now you're living here in the US, in Florida. But more, you're also working on the Florida for Ukraine initiative. You are working on the reception and integration of a few of the overwhelming number of refugees fleeing your country because of the Russian invasion. You try to bring some relief to those who have arrived here in Florida. I have no words to express my admiration for the mission you have. Based on that experience, I have a couple of questions for you. So, what are the most critical challenges displaced people face here in South Florida, and what are the most significant challenges for service providers like Florida for Ukraine? And from transatlantic perspective, how are race and ethnicity meaningful in the real experiences of individuals?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, that's a great honor for me to sit on the table with Vrushali and Jack. Definitely, I don't have so much experience in a theoretical knowledge of this matter, but I can share with you what I have been learning in the last 8 months since we founded Florida for Ukraine. Very important to understand that the group of the people who founded that, we have not really any experience in a nonprofit, and we definitely were not ready for amount of the work that was ahead of us. Just yesterday, we all been business owners, lawyers, just working in the hospitality, and today we have to take care of our country, our people, and unfortunately who had been forced displaced from their homes. So as an organization, we have 4 pillars that we are focusing on. First is humanitarian help. So we have a group of volunteers, we have donors who supporting us to gather humanitarian, any kind of source of help. It's a financial that we working very closely with the teams. We don't like to use this word because in the United States, people don't like to support the army, but this is what we do because we believe that that's essential help that currently required in Ukraine in order to protect the freedom. And not only the freedom of our country and our land, but in general, to stand for what is right and what is a democracy is. And we just believe that we have to stop this evil that just spreading around the Europe. So our main focus and main goal is to support the boys and girls right in the front line, who is the most heated areas. Our second focus is a political outreach. So we are co-founders of the coalition. Just recently, a few weeks back, we went to Washington as co-organizers of Ukrainian Action Summit. It was over 30 different organizations from all over states, not only Ukrainians, which was very interesting, Lithuanian, organization from Syria. We all came together to stand and to meet with our elected congresswomen and congressmen and representative of Senate in order to deliver them what is required for Ukraine, how they can help. And the big part of it, it was actually the conversation about the refugees and what kind of help they can provide. The fourth one, which is initially was created as something, I'm not gonna use the word fun part, but something more social, is the Ukrainian Women Club. Because once I'm gonna be talking about our type of refugees that we have in Florida, it's over 90%, 95% is the women and the children. So when before the full-scale invasion, in United States, there was not really a differentiate between Ukrainian people, Russian people, people from Moldova, Belarus. Everybody had been united as a Russian-speaking. So since the 24th of February, that was no longer possible for Ukrainians to be together in the same room with Russians for multiple reasons that we see in the news daily. So Ukrainian Women Club became a huge platform for women who just immigrated or who had been living here but they haven't been part of the Ukrainian community to unite and to support. And the fourth and the biggest part that we do is refugee support. So this, I think, something that takes the biggest amount of time because, again, we didn't have an experience and we didn't anticipate what's gonna come into us. And to immigrate to the country, to the new country, is always difficult. Difficult culturally, financially, but especially when you running away from a war that you haven't been expected, like you waking up at 5 a.m. and there is a bombing. So, and I think the biggest challenge for our immigrants is that it's families without the male representative. Because right after the war started, it's been announced in martial law in our country. So all males, all men from age 18 had to remain in the country. So just imagine the mother with 3 kids has to take a backpack and has to cross border to Romania, Poland, because that was a first that had been possible because there's all the flights had been suspended, so people had to cross to the nearest country as possible. So if we can go to the next one. So this is what I just was, so 90% of the refugees is the females with the kids. Another challenge that, of course, that over 13% of those people, it's the people who require special needs assistance, which is make it even more challenging and more difficult to cross. We unfortunately have a lot of examples when the kids had to cross the border by themselves just to have a phone number written on the hand because the mothers decided to stay behind and support the country. By the way, in Ukraine, the amount of the female soldiers is nearly 30% now, which is huge. And for cultural aspect, for Ukrainian, who is very, let's say, softer part of the family members never used to fight, it's a big percentage. So this is what we facing when we're talking about the refugees. It's very unprotected, very unsettled group of people. Since 24th of February, that's data that comes over nearly 15 million people cross the border. We are talking about 20% of our territory currently is occupied by Russian forces. So it's leaving over 30 million people who is in Ukraine. So when we're talking about 14 millions, it's a lot. It's a huge population. Luckily, a lot of people coming back, but still we're talking about millions and millions of people who are outside the country. Most of the people, of course, they settled in Europe, because the data that I was reviewing today, and it came across that there was a like questionnaire for the people who is currently abroad, Ukrainians, how many of them are planning to come back after the war will be over, and it's 85%. So when we're talking about Ukrainians, we don't like to say that we are immigrants. We are forced displaced people who are looking to come back home when the war will be over. If to talk specifically about Southern Florida and in general United States, so United States is really far away, and it's very challenging for people to get here on the first place. On the March 1st, it had been announced that all the Ukrainians are entitled to apply for the temporary protective status. It's a great initiative that nearly 60,000 people was fallen into this group. But here comes the biggest challenge that Jack had been talking about, the immigration processes. So the temporary protection status meant for the people who applying to get as fast as possible governmental support in terms of to confirm the status, to provide with the work authorization, and to give an opportunity for people to earn a living. What happened with Ukrainians TPS? Unfortunately, because it had been announced right even before the processes had been established, to receive a TPS and to receive the work authorization, it was on average taken 5 months. Which is, imagine, if you have a family and you have nowhere to live, you're in a completely new country, 5 months is a very long time. So that's where those people were coming to us. And we, just an organization without the governmental funding, so we had been cooperating with churches, with a Jewish organization who are extremely supportive to us because we have a big Jewish population in Ukraine. But it's challenging. After April 11, the Mexican border had been open. And this is how we got additional 20,000 people crossing the border. It's lasted for approximately 2 weeks, and in April 22nd, the new program had been introduced by President, and it's called U4U. That's when the Americans could apply to sponsor Ukrainian citizen to come to United States, even if they don't have a visa. This program worked much better because the length of the paperwork took much shorter. But still, we had a lot of people stay on the TPS, and it just was very tough. This is just a data that, interestingly, you will see that New York and Illinois and Washington is a top states that hosting Ukrainians, and there is a reason behind, because this is where the biggest Ukrainian diaspora is. Florida comes 5th, which is, considering that there is no Ukrainian diaspora here, very, very little, people still chose Florida as a destination to come. And I cannot really answer why, except maybe that's a great weather, and everybody in Ukraine seen the movies and know the word Miami, because I don't know. when we tell to people, well, you can go to Ohio, there's a great programs, they're like, no, Ohio, no, we're gonna stay in Miami. We're like, okay. So for you all Floridians, you should know that Florida and Miami is very popular amongst Ukrainians. So now we have here a lot of Ukrainians that we will be living together with. If we can go next slide. Yeah, sorry, I couldn't not to include the image of how really Ukraine looks like right now. And this is literally city center of Kyiv. So you can imagine what the people go through. And what's next for Ukrainians, and what's next for us as a community here, how we can support. The most important that this people who is arriving here, the challenge is that there is no affordable accommodation. There's all the processes are extremely lengthy. The language barrier prevent kids from going to school, and there is no possibility for them to do free English classes or any kind of sort of that. I'm not sure how we can support, but there's you know, this is what we are working with congresswomen and congressmen from Florida. What can we offer for these people to be integrated in a, you know, in our society? From being Ukrainian, I can tell you that we are extremely hardworking people, and we don't want to use the benefits of the country that already hosted us as a, you know, in such a dark times. But we need more. We need to make sure that the kids who extremely traumatized from running away from war, that at least they have an opportunity to go to normal schools, to meet and to have childhood that I think everybody deserved. So I don't know if I answered the question in fully. I think that definitely from coming from Ukraine, where is a very similar culture and the religion, it's much easier to integrate. Myself, I've been living in Middle East for last 10 years, and it's extremely difficult because the culture is so different. The Saudi Arabia is extremely different from what I got used to. So when Ukrainians come into Florida and to United States, it's closer to them. People are warm. You know, you have churches, you have same kind of concept of living. So that's already easier. But you should understand that it's going to be a very difficult for people because the mental health is affected. The woman is under a lot of stress to provide for their kids. And that's with the thought that your father, your brother, your husband is somewhere there fighting and can die any minute. So this is just the pictures actually from that we've been sharing with the Congress when we went to Washington. That's actually families who live now in Southern Florida, part of our community, and their stories how they've been running away. And that will be all. So the beautiful quote from our president that life will always win the death. And, you know, so if you want like to participate in any of our activities, you're more than welcome. We always welcome for any kind of volunteers or any kind of sort of help that you can provide us. We'll be very happy. And once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tyra. Well, now we open the question and Q&A sessions, question and answers. So those who have some questions, just raise your hand. We are going to give you the microphone. And, well, questions or comments or whatever you want. Here.
Hi, thank you all. That was really very interesting. I appreciate the discussion and I appreciate the web connectivities in practice. Jack, I had a question about the Martha Vineyard experience. What I didn't understand was whether there was any calculation that would backfire at all, whether there was a fear of losing the votes of Venezuelans here in Florida, Venezuelan American citizens, or even other votes of other either Latinx communities or other immigrant groups. Is the mindset that Venezuelans could be targeted that way because there wouldn't be any kind of like political loss to that stunt?
Yeah, so our politics nowadays around immigration is incredibly polarized, and on one side you have this very vehement anti-immigrant sentiment for people who may be thought of as undocumented, or even people applying for asylum or something like that. And so something that's important to remember is, to know that is, here in Florida, we have a very different Latino, Latinx community than in many other parts of the United States. Lots of people here have fled these, the dictatorial regimes that are from the left side of the spectrum. And so part of the political calculation is, and you see that here, I think in a lot of these elections coming up, is that it's like, okay, where are they going to go? Because they're not going to vote for Democrats, it's like because they have very successfully basically made Democrat and socialist like the same word. And so if you grew up here in the United States, it's like it's a very different reference for what is socialism. Lots of times in the United States, what we're thinking of is like Europe, but for people from Latin America, when socialist and socialism are described, it's it's Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, and so that's where I think it was, and it's been a very successful. Unfortunately, I mean, and I say this very not successful as in good, but it's been a very successful technique in regards to like those sort of stunts. They call them spectacles. This is part of what my dissertation gets into, these spectacles of immigration enforcement. It is different, though, transporting people from within the United States, because that's sort of new, and there's no like precedent for being like, oh, these people might come to Florida, so we're going to bus them or fly them to Martha's Vineyard. Like it's very strange. But I don't want to take up let some other questions come in here. But I think the blunt political calculation was, where are they going to go? Because they're not going to vote for Democrats. So
Next question. Okay.
Okay. Hello. First of all, thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting, all of you. So I have a first question with Mr. Jack Maguire. So it's about the migration policies of United States. And as you say, it's really hard to get out from the situation, and the solution is really hard. And I agree with that. And I want to ask you, like, what do you think? What is a possible solution, like in your opinion, that can solve this migration issue? Because of, for example, like low-paid workers, which is going to be a really big issue for the inflation, right? And we saw what's happened to the United States in this inflation. People are reacting like really bad about the president, and it's not it's just nothing compared to what it's going to be if there's not going to be like cheap workers, what we call it, And I have another question also. So should I ask right now, or? Yeah. So as I think Dr. Pathil was talking about migration, which was happening in the United States, not colonialism actually, which was happening here, and it was like a kind of a supremacy of white people, European people, and the Christianity and everything and stuff. So what I want to ask right now is about like what's happening, for example, in Ukraine, right? Like how world reacted. That's the correct way because that's the right way to react because it's a war and refugees need help. But we have seen like from European Union and United States a different approach. For example, like on Syrian refugees and like Middle Eastern refugees. And as you mentioned, like you had a meeting in Washington with different diasporas, and I think that that's a really good question. If we ask that, I think the migration policies have failed, and the differences, the cultural differences, like kind of means a lot in politics of United States and European Union. So my question is, do you think that European Union and US migration policies and refugee policies have failed towards Middle Eastern countries because they are Muslim and they have a different like religion, which is Islam, and they have different culture? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to go first?
Hi, thank you for your question. So I think that we have different approaches to requests for asylum around refugees, depending on the country of origin, right? And that has to do with things like religion. It has to do with how we understand these people to relate to our idea of our national, kind of who we are as a nation, which is also then connected to ideas about race, right? And I think that we can see this and this happens in various ways in the US. It also happens in various ways in the European context. We can absolutely see it in terms of people who try to come in from the Middle East. We can also see it, for example, look at the way folks are treated from Haiti, right, compared to Cuba and some other places. I think that national identity, is very closely aligned with ideas about sort of racial community and racial identity, and that very much shapes the policies and the politics around these things for both various European countries and for the U.S. If we think about in the European context, right, I mean, you have all kinds of population displacements because you have conflicts, you have population displacements because of climate, right? And if you look at who is, the people that are kind of left on the boats, right, and they're not even allowed to come on shore, who's allowed to cross borders, who sort of gets an easier time crossing borders. I mean, there are certain patterns that you see over and over again. So this is the while everybody is suffering, I mean, this is the piece of this that, sort of makes it even more tragic, right? So, yeah.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
So since we're talking about this, or like the refugees and everything, so do you think that actually, in my opinion, I think that the Europeans and like US, like the view of migration and like the refugees, especially after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, it's not because, for example, maybe they have the cultural differences with like Middle Eastern countries, and for example, there's like different like points of views and everything. But I feel like it's more political as well, because I feel like US and European Union have like felt the fear of the invasion itself, because the Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe, right? Mm-hmm. So they had to kind of welcome people, so they had to be friendly. So what I'm trying to say is like the conflicts in Middle East cannot really affect people in Europe or US, like in economically or maybe like in politically as well. But the Ukraine, which is the biggest country in Europe, can really affect people too, like in Europe, which is Poland, for example, right next to Ukraine, can be affected as well. So what I'm saying, maybe like these policies on refugees and the migrants cannot be really dependent on like cultural differences, but it can be really dependent on fear of people and the politicians, like for example, French politicians, Germans, even US, because that's the closest thing which happened after 21st century, like what's happening now in Ukraine. And I've never seen this kind of like refugee policies, for example, what US has now on Ukrainians in anywhere else like in the world, like for example like TPS, is because they're supporting really hard, and that's really good, and I think that that's what they have to do like with everybody. That's what I'm asking the question. So I feel like they have this political fear and like the gain, then that's why it's happening, not be like cultural differences itself.
So I think that there can always be multiple forces, right, operating together. So we don't have to pick one necessarily, but I'll let you speak.
Sure. In short, yes. But we have to remember that, you know, underlying a lot of political things is really those cultural processes that what Dr. Pathil is talking about. Is like there's a reason that these political majorities that are really driving political decisions are who they are. You know, they are in the United States, but this is changing. They are these majority white populations still that has a lot of that we don't think about it. You know, a lot of it isn't necessarily conscious, but it's like when we throw these images up there of it's like, you know, there are these people crossing the border, you know, and you throw these really sensationalized, you know, typically on the right side of the political spectrum, these images, you know, they'll be like, oh, criminal, you know, illegal alien like breaks into house or something and does something horrible, you know, and it tries to make it personal and tries to make it feel like it's going to happen to you, and it's, you know, it's just around every corner. You know, it's been those sorts of those feelings are underlying a lot of the politics of the situation. And, you know, it's really, so one reason that and it's a very significant reason that, for instance, Venezuelans, why we haven't done like so for instance, like TPS and refugee policies, you know, you're very correct. For instance, like the Syrian displacement, the displacement of refugees from Syria caused serious problems politically speaking. Not that, and they're not like these refugee populations aren't different in their need. You know, it's like these Syrian refugees were just as much in need as these Ukrainian refugees, but the political response was very, very different. And, you know, you're seeing these, like you said, it's underlying, it's this fear of the other. And when we go into like the theoretical stuff that Dr. Pathil was talking about, it's these narratives that have grown out of of colonialism, of all these different things where we have this society that we don't think about. Like we don't think about how this stuff is structured. We're just swimming in it, you know. and then they come up when these events happen. And so the political, and I was going to say this, so for like a reason Venezuelans and Nicaraguans and Cubans were getting through the border so easily, and this goes just straight into politics, is because Venezuelans in particular, we don't have relations with the Venezuelan government. And in order to deport people, you need to have relations with that government. And so the Venezuelan government is like, yeah, we're just not accepting planes of people that are deported. And Mexico is like, we're not taking anyone from Venezuela who's got like made it to the U.S. So it's like, you've got these things. So it's like Venezuelans make it to the U.S. and it's, you know, the United States is in this situation where they have to provide something. And then we have we get into this political narrative though, where, oh, Biden's got open borders and they're doing all these things. But it's like, well, if you had normal relations, like we don't recognize Nicolas Maduro as the president of Venezuela. We recognize Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela, even though he has zero power over anything. But it's politically impossible for the for Joe Biden or a politician in the United States to say, okay, no, we're going to recognize Nicolas Maduro and we're going to establish normal relations to try and deport people. I don't agree with that. But we can look at Venezuelans get TPS, but the other population I work with is Hondurans. And Hondurans have not gotten a new TPS. They got hit with two major hurricanes in 2020, two Category 4 hurricanes within 2 weeks of each other. And something that's important to remember is that Miami-Dade County has a GDP bigger than Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala combined, I'm pretty sure. And so you've got this, you know, and so we have these situations where it is just these really very political decisions that happen. And a lot of that is based upon what Dr. Pathil was talking about with these outgrowths of the society that we live in, which are based in that colonialism, that racism, not in the sense of like the individual, like you're a horrible person, but in the society that we lived in where we've structured resources to be collected resources and security to be concentrated in groups of people who tend to look like me. Anyway. So.
Yes, there is another question there.
So my question is about the American national identity and immigration, the relationship between those two, because we all know kind of on what this American national identity was built on. Americans, most of them, and America in general, was built on immigration and immigrants. Because of colonialism, because Europeans came here and settled here, right? And we all know who real Central Americans were, but that's for a different topic. So basically, I feel like my question is mostly considered in terms of what is the relationship? Why is this national American identity so high when most Americans are not real Americans? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I mean, yes, I don't want to offend anyone with this one, but everyone's an immigrant here, essentially, right? So why is there so much hatred towards immigrants from immigrants who were placed on this land, not born here? I just don't, it's been bothering me for a long time, that's why. I mean, whoever wishes to answer this question can answer, I don't really mind.
So thank you for your question. We have this national myth that this is a nation of immigrants, right? It's a very beautiful, kind of story that we tell about ourselves, right? And we have the symbols and all of that, but it's not exactly entirely accurate, right? I mean, if you think about the history of settler colonialism, some of us are indigenous people who are not immigrants, right? Some of us were brought here not voluntarily, not immigrants, right? And then you have so you have settler colonialism, which is a really important part of the story. And then you have the development of immigration laws, which are about regulating who gets to come here and be one of us, right? So even though we say we're a nation of immigrants, it's always been a much more complicated story that's been shaped by all of these inequalities that we're talking about. And you look at it over the course of the 20th century and now, I mean, it's new iterations of some of the same things over and over again, right? And these are the same conversations that we're continuing to have, except what we see these days is, as you said, spectacles and stunts because they're politically beneficial, right, to some politicians, right? I'm going to bus these people to this Democrat state, or I'm going to fly these immigrants to these Democrat state because it shows something about me and I want to be the president. It's a beautiful story, but I don't think we've ever quite been that. It's always been much more complicated and a little bit uglier than that, right? And I think that now there's an especial panic because there's all of this media coverage about how there's going to come a year pretty soon where the so-called minorities are going to be larger demographically than the so-called white people, right? And so there's a panic around this sort of myth about what we are versus our idea that we're European and that we come from England and the Nina and all of that stuff, right? That's threatened, right? Because the shifting demographics are threatening that sense of ourselves, right? So if you think of the political slogans that are emerging now, right, that are trying to appeal to especially some of the fear that's generated, it's about remember how we were, remember how it was really good, we're going to protect that, we're going to fight for that, we're not going to let all of these threats come and take away what this place is supposed to be, right? So the Nation of Immigrants thing, I think, has always been a lovely story, but it's always been much more complicated. I don't know if you want to add anything.
And it was something, and correct me if I'm wrong here, something I'm remembering is that settler colonialism we remember parts of the history. We in the United States, and I'm sure in a lot of countries around the world, we have this. History is also a process. Like what we teach history is like it's purposeful forgetting as well to build a narrative, and to teach people. It's like this is who we want to be, a sense of national identity, particularly in public schools. And so a key part of that settler colonialism is justifying, I believe. It's like, well, we're here. This is why we have the right to be here. And the part that we don't tell about the nation of immigrants is, well, why are we immigrants? And that's because it was a scorched earth genocidal campaign against native peoples in this country, and not just genocide against, not physical genocide, but cultural genocide as well. The very specific, very, very targeted campaign. And so it's there. A lot of this, I believe, what this has grown out of, to where we are now, where it's like we have to protect this idea of who we believe we are with that white European, comes from this thing of needing to justify why we're immigrants and why we are rightful owners of this territory, coming from that history of we committed genocide against this large group of people. And exactly. And so it's that process of purposeful forgetting. And you see that now, particularly with schools here in Florida. You get these politics of, the Stop Woke Act, I think, was something that's going on right now in Florida, where it's not, and it's trying to stop this teaching of not racism, sorry. The critical race theory is this catch-all term they're using now. And it's all based in that of it's these, like, reality that is threatening the imagined identity, really. And it goes exactly what Dr. Pathil talks about, is that we're becoming a much more pluralistic society demographically than we were before, and there is lots of freaking out on in I was trying to say what we think of as white. Among those people, there's a lot of freaking out because of the demographics of the situation. And so we don't want to talk about those things because it undermines our sense of, like, we're the rightful owners of this, and we can do what we want, really.
I have one more question.
Okay. Hi, my name's Nick. I'm an IR undergrad here at FIU. Thank you all for coming. So the presentation on migration and race, I think we spoke a lot about how people immigrating from one country to another are received, and how the people receiving them perceive the other. Not to get so much into the IR side of it, but the war between Russia and Ukraine has been going on since 2014. There were a lot of internally displaced people, and now obviously there's a lot of externally displaced people, and they are not immigrants, they're refugees, and they intend to go back. About 85%, I believe Ms. Daria said, intend to go back to Ukraine. This is the first time since World War II where people are returning home from a war, where they're going to get back, and their entire villages, cities, towns are completely destroyed. As we have seen, there's a big failure on the part of the U.S. and governments in Central America to improve conditions so that people may not want to immigrate out of their countries, or when they immigrate, they can be welcomed back to their home country. So and my question is for Annie, what lessons can Ukraine learn from the failures of kind of this immigration cycle here in, between the U.S., Central America, and South America, or any other country where, people are coming in, going back, and they don't fit in anywhere? What can Ukraine learn from that, so that when people return back home, this is the first time Europe will be dealing with this since 1945. So I think a lot of, immigration and refugee issues are new to Europe. Franny?
I wanted to pass it on to you because I think it's probably about the best thing that we have that can possibly happen at organizations like yours. That that's why I want to give the mic to you, because it's you know, that building of community, I think, is about the best thing, because everything else is so much in flux that local community efforts are really very, very important in this regard. So.
Well, to be honest, as much as I would like us to build a community here, and I want people to be extremely comfortable here, me, as being Ukrainian, my ultimate goal is for people to go back and to be able to return to Ukraine and to continue with their normal life. What I think, as much as the world and all the countries came together into supporting and welcoming all the refugees, I hope that with time all the countries will unite in the same way in order to rebuild Ukraine. Because this is a journey that's gonna be extremely difficult and will require a lot of investment. Once, you know, European Union and United States as a major player on the world of right now will be able to rebuild the country fast, I think then naturally the problem with the immigration will kind of dissolve. I mean, we're talking about just a couple 100,000 of the immigrants in the United States. When we talk about Poland, who hosted nearly 5 million people with the size of the 30 million, that's massive. And obviously it's gonna create a lot of tension eventually inside the Poland, Romania, Moldova, because now everybody, I don't like to use this word hype, but they are in hype of supporting Ukraine. But as we see with the conflict in Syria, which is already over 10 years, much more, unfortunately, the point of interest and it just will disappear. And then Ukraine will be one of those countries who had a war. So I think that's why it's so important that we all talk about, starting now, what can we do to rebuild the country? How can we participate in the projects, you know, all these occupied territories that already had been free from the Russians? How can we be there, rebuild it, and support people to get back to their lives as fast as possible? And I think it's in the best interest of every single country. Otherwise, you know, more time will pass. A year, once the kids will go to school, it's going to be very difficult to take them out. And, you know, people will start considering to settle where they are right now. And we don't want that, because we're talking about 30-40% of Ukrainians right now is away. So we need to come up together with a plan. How can we rebuild and support and to finish this conflict as possible? Not conflict, sorry, a war as fast as possible. So, thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your participation. Of course, big thanks go to our expert panelists today who helped us make sense of the realities and complexities of migration and race here in South Florida. In person, I want to thank Madame Christine Cali Sanchez and Dr. Thiel for this opportunity. And well, at the GIMI Center, we have a lot of things going on. Now Christine is going to make you some invitations. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you. What a pleasure. I have only to say the same. We really enjoyed. I really enjoyed this panel. Thank you so much. It was great, and with great people, good expertise, and we want to come back, of course. There are two slides that I wanted to show you. This one is about our short survey for you to fill out. This is the European Commission who is asking us to fill out. So you can just take a picture of the QR on your iPhone, and you will go straight to the survey. So it helps us for our Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. And again, we look forward to seeing you at our event at the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. Our website is miamieuc.edu. fiu.edu, and a lot of things which are going to arrive in the month of November. Some events in person, some events virtual as well, and we are counting the first one on the 3rd of November. We are going to talk about regional integration and European Latin American relations, so totally a different subject. A conversation on transition for clean energy on the 8th of November, and the 9th of November, we have our virtual conversation on EU Expert Carry Panel on the future of work in a transatlantic context. So please check our social media. We are looking forward to seeing you soon. And in the meantime, we wish you a great day. Thank you so much.